Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the shining beacon in PMP exam preparation. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. The objective of procurement management is to ensure that the project is able to efficiently acquire the product, result or service for the best price and quality while conforming to procurement policies and procedures. In this lesson, we'll give you an overview of procurement management. We clarify our role or perspective within the buyer-seller relationship. We discuss the contract and its importance. In procurement, we describe the make versus buy decision, which is at the basis of procurement, and consider factors and organizational policies which affect procurement. We look at different procurement sources, categories and needs. We examine more closely the role of the project manager in the procurement relationship and go through some things to consider in approaching procurement management. Procurement is complex and important, and there's a lot to say about it. That's why this lesson has two parts. We begin with an overview of procurement in part 1. We continue with the overview, then in part 2 do a review, give you a few sample questions, and also look ahead on the lessons to come. But we begin at the beginning with our usual overview of, well, what is procurement management? According to the PMBOK guide, project procurement management includes the processes that are necessary to purchase or acquire products, services, or results that are needed from the outside of the project team. As you should know by now, this definition then translates into the processes that are executed to get procurement done. The 4 processes that we have in procurement management almost follow the plan, do, check, act cycle, but there's also a close at the end, so it's plan, do, check, act, and close. But it all begins with plan procurement management, the process of documenting project procurement decisions, specifying the approach, and identifying potential sellers. We do this for every single item that we want to procure. Then we conduct our procurements. This would be the do part of this plan, do, check, act, close cycle. This is the process of obtaining seller responses, selecting a seller, and then awarding the contract. From here, we move on to plan, do, check, and act in the control procurements process, the process of managing procurement relationships, monitoring contract performance, and making changes and corrections as appropriate. And then, we have the close procurements at the end as well. That's the process of completing each project procurement. And if we stick with this metaphor of plan, do, check, act, and close, where do you think these 4 processes fall into the process groups? Well, the first one is easy. That would be our plan. That goes into the planning group. Then we have conduct procurements. That's our do process. Well, doing equals executing. Therefore, conduct procurements is in execution. Control procurements, that's our check and act kind of process. Well, that would be monitoring and controlling. And then, of course, at the end, we have close procurements there. That one's easy to guess once again. Yes, this one goes into the closing process group. Before we do anything else, let's talk about the word procurement. What does it mean? Well, it's really just a fancy way of saying you are buying something. It's no more and no less, but we call it procurement because this is the terminology that you will need to know and be familiar with for the PMP exam. Just as your projects will vary in scope, complexity, and type, so will your procurement. Procurement can be simple, but it can also be complex. Just as in other knowledge areas, the amount of work that you need to do to manage procurement on your project is very much dependent on the project, the industry, and the organization that you're working for. Some procurement transactions may be so straightforward that there are limited steps involved, while other procurement may be more complex and time-consuming. Procurement can also vary in the number of parties that are involved. At a minimum, you're going to have a buyer and a seller, but there could be other intermediaries, partners, and relationships involved. On your projects, you have probably had to deal with different types of contracts, agreements, or purchase orders. It is possible, though not recommended, to procure without any supporting documentation or paperwork. We'll discuss further along this lesson how a verbal agreement may constitute a full agreement for procurement. However, the more complex the transaction, the more heavily regulated the industry, or the more bureaucratic your organization is, then it is almost guaranteed that there will be more paperwork required in the procurement process. In very complex projects or programs, there may even be multiple contracts and subcontracts in place. When it comes to procurement management, we as project managers may be wearing one of two hats. We could either be the seller or we could be the buyer. Therefore, don't be deceived that procurement-related hats come with so many labels. A seller may also be known as a contractor, a vendor, a service provider, a source, or a supplier. A buyer may also be known as a purchaser, a customer, a client, or prime contractor. However, when we say you could be both a seller or a buyer, this does not mean that our company could not both buy and sell. For example, Company A buys multicolored widgets from Company B. Company B then may have a subcontract with Company C for yellow widgets. So in this example, Company A is the buyer of these multicolored widgets, and Company B becomes the seller to Company A, but Company B is the buyer towards Company C, who sells something to B. Here in the Project Management Prepcast, and also for the PMP exam, when we consider the buyer-seller relationship, we simplify. We assume that we are primarily wearing the buyer's hat. Only occasionally will we also turn it around and look at procurement from the point of view of the seller. This means that as part of our project, we are dealing with someone external to our project who is selling us a product. We become the buyer. They're selling us a service, a result, a product, whatever it might be. By outside of the project team, of course, we mean that this could be someone who is internal or external to our organization, just not within our small, defined project team. We've already used the term contract a couple of times in this lesson, so before we go any further, let's clarify what we mean by this term. Here is the definition from the PMBOK guide. A contract is a mutually binding agreement that obligates the seller to provide the specified product, service, or result, and obligates the buyer to pay for it. So you can see now how the contract defines what each party has to do. The seller under a contract is obligated to provide something of value for which the buyer is obligated to pay. Let's go more into detail here. A contract is first and foremost a legally binding document. It can be simple or complex, depending completely on the project's needs. A contract can make reference to other documents, like the proposal or marketing materials, and by doing that, these documents become part of the contract. Once you agree to a contract, you are bound by its terms and by its conditions. You agree to fulfill them, and so does everyone else who signs this contract. If one party of a contract feels that the other party is not fulfilling their part, well, they can take them to court, or more formally put, it is subject to remedy in the courts. And that is why most companies have a clear procurement rulebook and other policies and procedures in place that defines who is allowed to sign in their name on such a document. And trust me, they won't sign their name until the company's legal department has gone through the contract with a fine-tooth comb. Shakespeare wrote, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Though perhaps not as romantic, you might say that a contract by any other name may still be enforceable as a contract. In other words, a document may still serve as a contract, even if it's called something else. An organization may have other documents, such as the following, which serve as procurement contracts. An agreement, maybe. Strictly speaking, a contract is a form of an agreement. Formally, an agreement, according to the definition of the PMBOK Guide, is any document or communication that defines the initial intentions of a project. This can take a form of a contract, a memorandum of understanding, letters of agreement, verbal agreements, email, etc. It can be an understanding which may take the form of a memorandum of understanding. Another term, subcontract, is used when, apart from the principal contractor, another party is assigned as part of the obligation and tasks under an existing contract. Remember, a moment ago we had company A, B, and C, and one was subcontracting to the next for these multicolored widgets. That might be a subcontract involved there. And lastly, there could be a purchase order. This is more of a commercial document, which is used to request the service, product, or result from the seller. It usually includes the price, quantity, description, and delivery and payment terms. It is legally binding if the seller has accepted these terms. A contract is usually scrutinized by different people before it gets signed, and they would be looking at a contract from various angles. You, as the project manager, apart from simply checking that the price on the contract is as expected, you will look at the contract and focus on what is being described as the product, service, and result of the contract. Do the words adequately describe the product, service, or result that we are looking to buy? The legal department, however, they will look at the contract from a totally different perspective. They will look at the legalese and the contract language to limit the legal risk of us as the buyer and understand any legal implications. They are interested in the correct legal formulations of the contract as a document. The make versus buy decision is the kind of decision that is at the heart of project procurement management. Once we know that we need a product, service, or result, we're going to have to ask ourselves, well, am I going to make it or should I buy it? In this regard, outsourcing is another term that you probably have heard, and that refers to buying rather than to making something. And there is also a bit of crossover here from procurement management into the realm of risk management, because a contract with its different terms and conditions can be an effective way of managing and mitigating the risk and sharing potential risk with the seller. For instance, if you need technology on your project for which you don't have the necessary expertise in-house, it's probably risky to build that know-how internally first. It's much less risky if you decide to find an external vendor who has the technical know-how and who is able to sell that know-how to you at a price. In this particular case, the vendor now assumes that risk for you, and you pay the vendor for his service. The make versus buy decision, apart from being a risk management decision, is also a strategic choice. You need to consider, among other things, such as regulations, competition, and market trends. Use an economic analysis method, such as a cost-benefit analysis, to help make your choice whether you're going to make or buy. Here are some more factors that play into the procurement decision. Fundamental is, of course, the cost or price consideration. You need to be wary of the complete cost. For example, if there is a physical product, you have to consider the purchase price of the item itself, but then factor in any transportation fees, any receiving or inspection cost. The availability of materials. Well, if there is some unique or scarce component that you require, you may have little choice but to procure it from the supplier who can provide it. Scarcity, as we know from the law of supply and demand, could mean that you will very likely have little power. As a buyer, you're just going to have to pay the price. Particularly for goods, shipping and delivery is very relevant. As a buyer, you'd want goods to be delivered when you need it and packaged and handled as specified. Quality, you as the buyer are specifying the final acceptance criteria that the seller has to meet. And then there is payment processing, ease of managing the payment and any payment reversals with respect to procurement returns may factor into your vendor choice. As a buyer, you want to more easily manage your payable and receivable accounts. Organizational policies, rules, regulations, and procedures, they play a big part in procurement. This is to provide the appropriate checks and balances in the process and to prevent any fraud or abuse of power. We've already mentioned earlier on how signing authority is defined and controlled and can be very limited. Some companies, for example, have specific policies which specify ceilings on what an individual has the authority to sign for. There may be some contracts so large that only the CEO of the company has the authority to agree and sign the document. Furthermore, the policies, they may also mandate the involvement of specialists in the procurement process, and this may typically include specialists in contracting or the legal department who may write out the contract for you. There may be specialists from purchasing. Your company may also have policies in place that clearly define what you can and what you cannot buy without the involvement of the purchasing department. The policy may, for instance, say that off-the-shelf products can be purchased at your discretion, at the discretion of the project manager. That way, for instance, you do have the purchasing power to get all the office materials for your project, like flip charts or having full-color photocopies made at an office shop. The policy may also indicate when those with technical expertise need to be involved. It could be expertise based on what is being procured, or it could be expertise on other terms relevant to the contract. For example, finance may have to get involved if there is a heavy or complex financial element in the contract. As you learn about the individual processes of procurement management, you will find that each of these project procurement processes is going to be repeated at least once in each project, or one too many times in each project's phase. Let's take a look at why this is the case. First of all, every project has some form of contract between buyers and sellers, and even if the contract is not on paper, you still have a verbal contract, and therefore you will have to go through the procurement management processes. And more than just that, you will have to go through all procurement processes for each of the items that you will need to buy. So, if you buy a light bulb from a vendor, a desk from another vendor, and a chair from a third vendor, you will have to go through all four processes for the light bulb, the chair, and also for the desk. You can do them simultaneously, but you will do them. So, if we ask that old question, how many people does it take to change a light bulb? Well, we can see that based on what we know so far, depending on your procurement processes, likely more people than you may originally have thought. And the question of who is involved in procurement of that light bulb, or really any product, service, or result you need to procure, depends on your organizational policies and how your organization is structured. For example, legal, contracting, and purchasing functions, they may either be centralized or decentralized. Centralized is where you, the project manager, will not only have to give the contract to the legal department for review and possibly even signing it, you may not even be allowed to write it yourself. If you have a centralized purchasing department, then policy may dictate that every project that needs to purchase an item is required to include them in the process. On the other hand, in a decentralized organization, you might have contract managers assigned to the project. This person works for you and manages all the contracts on your project for you. This can be a full-time or a part-time position, and it makes sense if your project is a large endeavor. You can see how there can be pros and cons to each kind of setup. For centralized, you can establish and impose a standard process throughout the organization. Decentralized organizations may find it difficult to enforce a standard. They would rather have greater flexibility and less bureaucracy in the procurement process. For centralized, you have expertise and support concentrated under a shared function across the organization. For decentralized, they have the advantage of everyone not having to bear the overhead cost of a centralized contracting or purchasing function. Where there is a centralized procurement function, the organization is more likely to be able to take advantage of volume discount from their vendors, whereas in the decentralized procurement, you may not be able to get the better price, but you may be able to manage a quicker acquisition. In either case, you have to be able to work within the centralized or decentralized environment in which you work. And with that, we have come to the end of part 1 of this lesson. So it's time for Justine to say,
See you in a bit.
and of course I say, until next time.